Nobody walks off stage in the middle of their biggest show and refuses to give the audience what they came for, unless you're Johnny Cash. And unless you have a reason so important that you're willing to destroy your career over it. April 17, 1970. The White House, East Room. An audience of 200 of the most powerful people in America, including the President of the United States, waiting to hear the song that had made Johnny Cash a household name. Cash stood on stage, guitar in hand, and said no. Not quietly, not apologetically, he just refused. What happened in the hours leading up to that moment, and what happened after, would define who Johnny Cash really was. Not the image, not the persona, the man. But to understand why Cash made the most dangerous decision of his career, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a phone call that should have been an honor, and felt like a trap. Late March 1970, Johnny Cash was at home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, when the phone rang. It was someone from the White House. President Richard Nixon wanted Johnny Cash to perform at a state dinner. A formal event, black tie. The elite of Washington, D.C., cabinet members, senators, foreign diplomats. The kind of crowd that didn't normally listen to country music. For most performers, this would be the pinnacle of success. A presidential invitation. Validation from the highest office in the land. The kind of moment that legitimized a career. Cash's first instinct was to say no. He didn't like Nixon, never had. Cash had watched Nixon campaign on law and order, code words for cracking down on protesters, hippies, and anyone who questioned the Vietnam War. Cash had performed for soldiers. He'd seen what the war was doing to young men. He didn't want to be used as a prop for an administration he fundamentally disagreed with. But June Carter convinced him to reconsider. "It's the White House," she said. "It's not about Nixon. It's about the office, about the country." Cash thought about it and reluctantly agreed. But there was a condition in the invitation that Cash hadn't paid attention to at first. A song request. President Nixon didn't just want Johnny Cash to perform. He wanted Cash to perform specific songs. 2 songs to be exact. "Okie from Muskogee" by Merle Haggard and "Welfare Cadillac" by Guy Drake. Cash read the request and felt his stomach drop. Because those weren't his songs, and more importantly, they weren't just random country hits. They were political statements. "Okie from Muskogee" was Merle Haggard's 1969 anthem celebrating small-town conservative values. The lyrics mocked hippies, protesters, and drug users. Lines like, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee," and "We don't burn our draft cards down on Main Street," were direct attacks on the counterculture movement. The song had become a rallying cry for Nixon's silent majority, the conservative Americans who supported the war, supported law enforcement, and opposed the social upheaval of the 1960s. "Welfare Cadillac" was even worse. It was a novelty song mocking people on welfare, specifically Black Americans, suggesting they were lazy, fraudulent, and driving expensive cars on taxpayer money. It was racist, cruel, everything Cash found repulsive. And Nixon wanted him to perform both songs in front of 200 people at the White House. Cash called his manager. "I'm not doing it." The White House wasn't asking. They were expecting. And when Cash's manager tried to push back, tried to explain that these weren't Cash's songs, that he'd never performed them before, that they didn't fit his style, the White House staff made it clear. This wasn't a request. This was the deal. The president had personally selected these songs. They represented the values of his administration. And if Johnny Cash wanted to perform at the White House, he would perform them. Otherwise, the invitation would be withdrawn. Cash's manager laid out the options. Option 1. Perform the songs. Make the president happy. Secure future opportunities. Stay in the good graces of the most powerful man in the world. Option 2. Refuse. Insult the president. Get blacklisted from Washington. Possibly face backlash from conservative fans who loved Nixon. From a career standpoint, the choice was obvious. Do what the president wanted. But Johnny Cash had spent the last 3 years rebuilding his life on one principle. Don't compromise who you are for anyone. Not for record labels, not for radio stations, not for critics, and not for the President of the United States. By April 1970, Johnny Cash was at the peak of his fame. At Folsom Prison and at San Quentin had made him a cultural icon. His variety show on ABC, The Johnny Cash Show, was one of the most watched programs on television. He was crossing over from country to pop. Everyone knew his name. But success hadn't changed what Cash believed. He'd always identified with outcasts, with prisoners, with poor people, with the people who got stepped on by the system. And he'd always been suspicious of authority. Cash had been arrested multiple times. He'd spent nights in jail. He knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the law, and he'd never forgotten it. More than that, Cash had become increasingly political, not in a partisan way. He didn't align with Democrats or Republicans, but he'd started speaking out about issues that mattered to him: prison reform, Native American rights, poverty, the human cost of the Vietnam War. In 1969, Cash had recorded What Is Truth, a song defending young protesters and questioning the establishment's dismissal of youth activism. He'd invited anti-war activists onto his TV show. He'd performed benefit concerts for causes Nixon opposed. And now Nixon wanted him to sing songs that mocked the very people Cash had spent his career defending. It wasn't going to happen. Cash called the White House back. He'd perform at the state dinner, but he wouldn't sing Okie from Muskogee or Welfare Cadillac. He'd sing his own songs. The White House pushed back, hard. The president had made a personal request. It would be disrespectful to refuse. Cash stood his ground. "I don't know those songs well enough to perform them," he said, which was technically true. He'd never performed them live. But everyone knew that wasn't the real reason. The White House tried negotiating. What about just Okie from Muskogee? Just one song? Surely Cash could learn one song. Cash said no. What about a different Merle Haggard song? Something less controversial? Cash said no. The negotiations went back and forth for days. Finally, the White House relented. Sort of. Cash could perform his own songs, but the expectation was clear. Keep it safe. Keep it patriotic. Don't embarrass the president. Cash agreed to the terms. He was lying. The day of the performance, Johnny Cash and June Carter flew to Washington, D.C. They arrived at the White House in the afternoon. A Marine escort took them through the building. The East Room was already set up, chairs arranged in rows, a small stage at one end, an American flag behind it. Cash did a quick sound check. Then he met the president. Nixon was charming, friendly. He shook Cash's hand, thanked him for coming, made small talk about music in Tennessee. But there was something in Nixon's eyes, a calculating quality, like he was assessing Cash, trying to figure out if Cash was someone he could control. Cash smiled, played along, and said nothing about what he was planning to do. At 8 p.m., the guests began arriving. Senators, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, foreign ambassadors, the elite of Washington, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, filing into the East Room like they were attending an opera. President Nixon took his seat in the front row. Johnny Cash walked on stage. He was wearing black, as always. But this wasn't the rebellious black of his prison concerts. This was formal, respectful. He looked like he belonged there, which made what happened next even more shocking. Cash picked up his guitar and started playing. But not Okie from Muskogee, not Welfare Cadillac, not even one of his big radio hits. He played What Is Truth, the song defending protesters, questioning authority, challenging the establishment to listen to young people instead of dismissing them. The room went silent. Not the good kind of silent, the uncomfortable kind, because everyone in that room knew what this song was. They'd heard it on the radio. They knew it was a direct challenge to everything Nixon stood for. And Cash was singing it. In the White House, 10 feet from the president. Nixon's face didn't change, but people sitting near him said later that his jaw tightened. His hands clenched. Cash kept singing. When the song ended, there was polite applause. Scattered, uncertain. Cash didn't acknowledge it. He launched into the next song. If What Is Truth was a warning shot, the Ballad of Ira Hayes was a declaration of war. The song told the story of Ira Hayes, a Pima Native American who helped raise the American flag at Iwo Jima during World War II. Hayes became a national hero. His face was on the cover of magazines. He was celebrated, paraded around the country, used as a symbol of American courage. And then, when the parades ended, he was forgotten. He returned to the reservation, poor, unemployed, struggling with alcoholism and PTSD. He died drunk in a ditch at age 32. The song was a brutal indictment of how America treated its heroes, particularly Native American heroes. And Cash sang every word with absolute conviction. Call him drunken Ira Hayes. He won't answer anymore. Not the whiskey-drinking Indian, nor the Marine that went to war. The room was frozen. Because this wasn't entertainment. This was confrontation. Cash was telling the President of the United States, in his own house, in front of his own guests, that America abandoned the people who sacrificed for it. Nixon stared straight ahead, expressionless. When the song ended, the applause was even thinner. Some people didn't clap at all. Cash still wasn't done. Over the next 45 minutes, Johnny Cash performed a set list designed to make everyone in that room uncomfortable. He sang about prisoners, about poverty, about injustice. He sang gospel songs, not the safe, comforting kind, but the ones about judgment and accountability. He sang Man in Black, a song explaining why he wore black. I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down, livin' in the hopeless, hungry side of town. Every song was a statement. Every song was a reminder that the people in that room, the powerful, the wealthy, the connected, were not the people Johnny Cash sang for. And notably, conspicuously, he never sang his biggest hit. He never sang I Walk the Line, the song everyone expected, the song Nixon probably wanted, the safe, romantic ballad that wouldn't offend anyone. Cash didn't perform it. Not because he forgot, not because it didn't fit the set list, but because performing it would have been giving Nixon what he wanted. And Cash had decided, the moment he walked into that room, that he wasn't going to perform on command. When the concert ended, President Nixon stood up and shook Cash's hand. In front of the cameras, he smiled, thanked him, said the performance was wonderful. But people who were there said Nixon's handshake was cold, perfunctory. And as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, Nixon turned and walked away without another word. The message was clear. You embarrassed me. Cash didn't care. He and June left the White House that night, knowing they'd burned a bridge, possibly multiple bridges. And Cash felt lighter than he had in weeks. The White House didn't publicly criticize Cash. That would have made Nixon look petty, weak. But privately, the word went out. Johnny Cash was not to be invited back. Conservative commentators who'd supported Cash started questioning his loyalty, his patriotism. Some accused him of disrespecting the office of the president. Radio stations in conservative markets reduced airplay of his music. Some venues canceled bookings, saying they didn't want political controversy. Cash's manager warned him, "This is going to cost you." Cash's response, "Good." The White House concert wasn't just about 2 songs. It was about whether Johnny Cash was going to let powerful people tell him who to be. Nixon had tried to use Cash as a prop, a symbol, a way to legitimize his administration's values by associating them with a beloved country star. And Cash refused. Not by canceling, not by making a scene, but by showing up and being exactly who he was. He sang for prisoners, for Native Americans, for protesters, for the forgotten. And he refused to sing the songs that mocked them. That refusal, that quiet, deliberate act of defiance, said more about Johnny Cash's character than any interview or public statement ever could. Cash never performed at the White House again during Nixon's presidency. He was never invited back, and when Nixon resigned in disgrace 4 years later, after the Watergate scandal, some people remembered that Johnny Cash had seen through him from the beginning. But the real impact wasn't political, it was personal. Because after that night, Johnny Cash knew something about himself. He couldn't be bought, he couldn't be controlled, and he wouldn't compromise his values for anyone, not even the President of the United States. That knowledge gave him freedom. For the rest of his career, Cash did whatever he wanted. He took risks. He invited controversial guests on his TV show. He recorded albums that didn't make commercial sense. And when people asked him why, he'd think back to that night in the White House, the night he said no to the most powerful man in the world and walked away with his dignity intact. Years later, documents from the Nixon White House were declassified. Memos, notes, planning documents for the state dinner. One memo, written by a Nixon aide, explained why the president had requested Okie from Muskogee and welfare Cadillac. These songs represent the values of the silent majority. Having Johnny Cash perform them will signal that mainstream American culture, including country music, supports the president's agenda. It wasn't about music, it was about politics, about using Cash's credibility to shore up Nixon's image. And Cash had refused to play along. "I Walk the Line" was Johnny Cash's signature song. Written in 1956, it had been his first #1 hit, the song that made him famous. A simple, honest declaration of loyalty and love. It was the song everyone wanted to hear, and it was the song Nixon probably expected. A safe choice, a crowd pleaser, a way to end the performance on a note of unity and tradition. But Cash didn't sing it, because "I Walk the Line" was about personal integrity, about keeping promises, about staying true to yourself, and performing it for an audience that wanted him to compromise everything he believed in would have been a lie. So he left it out, not as an insult, but as a statement. Some things are too important to perform on command. The White House concert cost Johnny Cash, not his career. He was too big to be destroyed by one performance. But it cost him opportunities, access, goodwill from people in power. For years afterward, Cash was viewed with suspicion by conservative politicians and commentators. He was labeled difficult, unpredictable, political. Some doors closed, but Cash didn't regret it, because he understood something most people spend their lives avoiding. Integrity is expensive. Standing up for what you believe in, really standing up, not just talking about it, means losing things. Opportunities, money, relationships. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. Johnny Cash had done that before. In the 1960s, when addiction had turned him into someone he hated. He wasn't going to do it again. Not for Nixon. Not for anyone. After the White House concert, a reporter asked June Carter Cash if she was worried about the backlash. June smiled. "Johnny's been getting in trouble his whole life," she said. "This is just the first time he got in trouble for doing the right thing." The story of Johnny Cash refusing to sing at the White House isn't a story about politics. It's a story about autonomy, about the right to say no, even when saying no costs you something, even when powerful people expect you to comply. Johnny Cash walked into the White House as a guest, but he left as himself, and that mattered more than any song he could have sung.